Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see your faces. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 14th seminar already in phase 4 of the International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series. And they are, of course, organized by the Global South Network. Before we begin, I would like to thank Dr. Nauman Riayat, lecturer in law at Leicester Law School, and who's the founder and chief convener of Global South Network. And we want to thank you for running this weekly seminar series. My name is Professor Gwen Bouvier, and I'm sharing today's session. I work at Shanghai International Studies University, which indeed is in Shanghai, in China. My research interest lies with social media and the quality of civic debate that happens on there. I've also published about representation, which then hangs together with my very frequent use of multimodality and critical discourse analysis. I'm also the associate editor for social semiotics and review editor for Discourse in Society and the Journal of Multicultural Discourses. So I think first and foremost, I really wanted to announce our speaker today. It is Nicholas Anakwue, who is doing an ESRC-funded PhD. He is from political science at Queen Mary University of London. Nicholas, you have an MA in African and Diaspora Studies at the University of Lagos, Nigeria, and I am told, first-class BA in philosophy at the University of Ibadan, also in Nigeria. Yep. Your research interests are in the area of digital politics, social movements, comparative politics, African studies, and African political science and philosophy. So I then move on to Dr. Obert Hodzi, who we have the pleasure as today having as our discussant. Dr. Hodzi is a senior lecturer in politics at the School of Histories, Language and Cultures at the University of Liverpool. Now, prior to joining the University of Liverpool, he was a postdoc researcher at the University of Helsinki, Finland. And he's been a visiting researcher at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies in the Nordic Africa Institute, Renmin University of China, and the African Studies Center at Boston University. That sounds really nice. You also have worked for international and regional organizations in Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Germany on democratic governance and transitional justice projects. He is admitted as a legal practitioner in the High Court of Zimbabwe. And one of your recent publications, I believe, has focused on social media and citizen-led accountability in political protests. And then we get to our peer commentator for today, who is Selam Mussie Tadesse. You're a PhD candidate at the Department of Culture and Communications, University of Westminster. And that is where you're doing your PhD, which is titled Women's Movements in Africa, Digital Collective Identity Building and Offline Organizing in Ethiopia and Kenya. I think that places you as a very good peer commentator. Excellent. Happy to have you. So today, Nicholas will present a chapter of his ongoing PhD research, which is titled From Tweets to the Streets, Mobilizing Collective Political Identities in the hashtag EndSars and hashtag ThisFlag. Good, I'm looking forward to it. Just as a matter of housekeeping, Nicholas, you will have about 30 to 35 minutes for your too. I will start making weird noises and coughing auspiciously that it's time. This will then be followed by 5 minutes for the comments and questions from both the discussant and the peer commentator. And then, if time permits, we will have a 15-minute Q&A session with the attendees. So, I think without further ado, Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gwen. My name is Nicholas Anakwue. I'm a PhD candidate at Queen Mary University of London. And today I'll be discussing the kernel of my research project, From Tweets to the Streets, Mobilizing Collective Political Identities in EndSars and ThisFlag. I'll start off my conversation today with the context of the increasing penetration and spread of digital technologies on the African continent. As of 2023, Srinivasan hold that Africa is recorded as the largest region, the region with the largest growth in connectivity when compared across other regions of the world. And there's also a significant reduction of about 2 pp in coverage gaps within Africa as against other parts of the world, indicating that while Africa, yes, it's still far off the mark in terms of digital penetration, there's really increased growth and fast-paced growth in adoption of digital technologies on the African continent. And this is very significant because when you trace the dynamics of contention in Africa, you can plot it, according to Howard and Hussein, across three pivotal moments. The first at the edge of decolonization, where you had a lot of trade unions, political parties that latched onto nationalist feelings and sentiments to drive for freedom from colonial shackles. And that was signified like the first pivotal moment of contention in Africa. The second came with the quest for democratic transitions from about the 1980s to about the 2000s. And these were led majorly by civil society groups that had formed, largely funded by external donors, to drive for increased focus on democratic governance, on citizenship rights and accountability, and transforming the African landscape also with the emergence or the shift towards democracy in a lot of these countries. The third pivotal moment is one of interest to me because the contention seems to take on a new shape. And this happens with the Arab Spring in 2011, latching on the back of the adoption and emergence of digital technologies on the continent, not just in terms of social media and the internet, but also some digital technologies like the radio and the mobile phone that was prominent at that time through messaging, SMS messaging. And you can see that the Arab Spring utilized or leveraged these new forms of connectivity to reach a larger audience than had previously been with the traditional social movement organizations that had happened on the continent. Dawud and Fox point to this fact, averring that the protest events on the continent have been on a significant rise. And you can see that in the graph on the right, where particularly between 2015 and 2020, protest events witnessed a huge spike. And this is particularly the time period that I'm interested in my research project from 2017 upwards. The map of protest events on the continent around that same time period also point to the fact that there have been an increased spate of protest events across the continent. And we can, scholars point to the fact that aside from these three pivotal moments, that there's a fourth current moment that we are in with an increased wave of protests across the continent. And you see that even currently with conversations, social media has been rife recently with conversations about Blessed Geza in Zimbabwe and the March 31st protests. Even in Nigeria last week and into this week, we've had the Take It Back movement protests that I've been witnessing here. There was also the #End Bad Governance protest last year in Nigeria as well in October. And then even across the continent, in Mozambique, in Kenya, with the Reject Finance Bill protests. So a lot of these protest events are happening. And these new forms of contention tend to ride on the back of internet connectivity, enabling greater opportunities for people to connect with each other, to share information and mobilize effectively. They're also majorly organic and are driven by dissenting and angry young people on social media and leverage the quasi-decentralization of social media as well. However, scholars may argue that a lot of these movements are all bark and no bite. And here's where I drop the relevance of contention. Some scholars point out that #activism in itself is ill-equipped to really effect any political change. And a legitimate argument at that, because they argue from the viewpoint that a lot of these networked individuals exhibit shallow commitment or low commitment because of the low risk participation involved. However, in spite of these valid points, when you look at the government responses in these various countries in terms of repressive online and offline tactics, the securitization of dissent, we can see a lot of these even in these recent protests, both in Zimbabwe and Nigeria recent, The deployment of misinformation campaigns, Reuters details a lot of these in its 2023 report, and increased presence and engagement of government officials on social media to try and understand and learn from what is happening. You see that these events are having significant effects on the political pulse of their countries. And so I feel very interested in understanding this phenomena, but not from the angle of political change. I think political change is not the hill I want to die on. I prefer to look at the phenomena of identity formation and mobilization dynamics that happen with these new forms of contention that are happening on the continent. And so my look through the literature starts off with Tilly and Taro, as almost with all look through social movements, where they detail that contentious politics is often found at the intersection between contention, collective action, and politics. They argue that contention largely arises from an individual or a group deciding to have competing claims or to make competing claims against another groups or another people's interests. And these claims often take the form of either existence claims, where they say we exist, we are. In the context of my research, even the creation of a hashtag is an existence claim to say this is what we are about. And program claims that say what the movement is intending to achieve. So we advocate for, we want to see this change, to see a particular change or a particular objective that they are fighting for. So these claims or this process of claim making is what I understand as that a gradual process of identities being formed in the process. Tilly emphasizes, however, that the success of social movements rests on the institutional structures of formalization of the mobilization process. And he terms these institutional structures as social movement organizations, citing some as workers' unions. In the context of my research, one could link it to trade unions or civil society groups that exist now that are somewhat quasi-structured. I know there's the argument as to whether they are really structured as against being unstructured, but Tilly's argument is rather on this formalization of the mobilization process. And with the entrance of ICT and social media, these concepts or understandings of social movements have somewhat changed. And this is evident in the fact that through social media, participants can have access to widely appealing claims to contentious action, as against prior circumstances where they were sort of circumscribed by space and time. Social media gives them a larger playing field on which to win interest and to mobilize support as well. And so Bennett and Segerberg introduced the notion of connective action that helps identify networked individuals that push out personal action frames to mobilize support around a particular cause. And he uses this notion to contest Tilly's concept of collective identity. However, I feel that my initial assumption with the research is that these two arguments can go hand in glove, and that connective action extends also into the realm of collective action through the social identity model. And here I argue that I think it's Ayn Rand that points out that the political cannot be individual, it cannot be personal. The political is often a framing of we against them. And this is an important thing in understanding how collective action extends into that collective. I think that collective identities are formed in the process of claim making, whether through personal action frames that finally achieve some kind of shared nuances or commonalities that help people to galvanize and unite together under a certain cause. And that this formation of identities in turn somewhat reinforces or makes effective the process of mobilization. For the purpose of my research, I conceptualize collective identities as social arrangements that exemplify shared stories of who a people are, how they are connected, and what shared events happen to them. And these identities become political when the government becomes a party on either side of the divide. And I draw this from Tilly majorly. Tilly argues that there are 4 criteria that help to buttress this point. The first being that there would exist an us versus them continuum. The second, that there would be a set of relations within the boundary, a set of relations across the boundary, and stories about the boundary and its relations. So basically, I'm looking for shared stories that help to unite people across differences and draw them together towards a particular cause or a given cause. And this is sort of like a visual map of my conceptual and theoretical framework, which is constantly changing, I must say. But I try to look at 3 variables here, the first being #activism. And I'm trying to conceptualize it under Tilly, but at the same time, find its nuances in terms of the introduction of social media and the internet technologies, and how this changes the dynamics for Tilly's conception. When I started off my PhD, I was initially interested in deconstructing Tilly's concept of the wonk, which is how he sort of looks at identity as worthiness, looking through the frames of worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. But quantitatively, I had issues with that, so I had to shelve that. But I conceptualized #activism under Tilly's social movement theory, and then collective political identities from the angle of Melucci and Castells, which Tilly and Taro also reproduced, and then the framing theory of Goffman. And on the mobilization side, most scholars often try to conceptualize mobilization in 2 ways, either through the resource mobilization theory of McCarthy and Zaud, or the political opportunity structure theory. I choose the political opportunity structure theory because of the nuances of the cases that I'm understudying, which I will discuss later, and then the theory of connective action of Bennett and Segeberg. So my central research question is basically how #activism influences the formation and mobilization of collective political identities, and how these processes differ in the political and social context of EndSars in Nigeria and ThisFlag in Zimbabwe. And I do this using a mixed methods analysis that combines social network analysis with qualitative interviews. On the first side, I decide on these cases based on J.S. Mill's method of agreement, which is an inductive approach, basically, that identifies very different cases to understudy a particular phenomena. And this method helps me pick these 2 cases because of their difference in structure. EndSars in Nigeria is largely thought of as a leaderless protest or decentralized protest. So you had diffuse leadership with just pockets of leadership. I would put that leadership in quotes because they came out to sort of lead various parts of the movement. There was no central structure to the movement or central leadership of the movement. And then the ThisFlag protest in Zimbabwe was rather centered around the personality and impetus of Ivan Mawarire. So they're different in structure. And then the socio-political context were also largely different. In Nigeria, the protest was basically around ending police brutality and ending the SARS unit, which is the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, an arm of the police that had gone rogue somewhat and was effecting a lot of attacks on citizens, rape, and all sorts of atrocities that were detailed by Amnesty Nigeria later on. So that was on EndSars. But for Zimbabwe, you could see that the protest centered majorly around economic depression. There was hyperinflation at that time, and Mawarire was largely motivated by the struggle to fend for himself and his family, to put out the initial video that sparked collective angst. So why these were a bit different, one could see that there were certain points of convergence within these two movements that also make me interested in them. The first being that these movements were largely organic. They were not driven by the traditional movements, social movement organizations, or by traditional activists, on both of them. And secondly, they were hashtag driven. So they rode on the back of hashtags put out on social media, on Twitter and Facebook. And then they were youth-led, majorly youth-led. So you had a lot of dissenting youths, uncomfortable with the circumstances of their lives at that time. And there was also the proliferation of symbols that was used to drive these movements, which I would talk of later. So, I think finally, one other important point here is that in spite of the difference in socio-political context, one can still find some areas of convergence as well. For example, in the EndSars protests, even though police brutality was front and center, there were underlying issues of economic depression, underemployment and unemployment that the youths were facing that drew them to protesting. It also occurred around the time when the COVID-19 pandemic was raging and Nigeria was celebrating its independence in October, its 60th independence. And people were asking, what have we achieved so far since independence? So there were still some similar underlying issues between these two cases. I tried to trace the trajectory of the entire protest movement from the closest context. There are larger contexts beyond these. But one important thing here is that across both protests, they seem to start around the same time. So EndSars, even though it majorly kickstarted October 3rd, 2020, when the video of the brutal killing of a young man in Ughelli, Delta State by SARS officials was put out on Twitter. By 2017, it had initially started. So Amnesty released a report in 2016 that detailed the atrocities that SARS was committing and put it out on Twitter and on Facebook. And this sparked some outrage. And by 2017, the hashtag first emerged. So the hashtag emerged with just about 100,000 tweets, people angry with what was happening, but no real action. It never translated to real action on the streets up until 2020, October of 2020, when that video of brutal killing was put out. And then you had a nationwide protest erupting up until October 20th, 2020, when the government had to quell the protests violently by shooting at protesters at the toll gate and killing scores of them. So that was when the protest died out. For ThisFlag, it also emerged around that same time in 2017. And that was when the video was put out by Mawarire, particularly April of 2016, April of 2016 was when the video was first put out by Mawarire, and it sparked national outrage somewhat because people identified with certain elements in the video, which I would speak on later, that were very critical to the success of his mobilization effort to get people involved. So my research basically, like I shared earlier, uses mixed methods. I combine social network analysis with qualitative interviews. I have a collection of about 180 tweets, which I'm working with, collating and rearranging into panels to understudy and I arrange them into like panels on their tweet occurrence. I'm also using algorithms, which are exponential random graph models, to model the network growth over time and to avoid model degeneracy so that my model doesn't bring out unmatch the observed effect. I'm using the pseudo maximum likelihood estimation to manage that process. So I'm still currently running my experiments. I have some insights already from the initial experiments I've run around centralization. So I've run experiments around centralization of the network using degree centralization and eigenvector centralization to identify influential nodes in the two networks. I've also grouped these networks into communities using the Louvain community detection algorithm. And then I'm currently conducting fieldwork interviews. I'm in Nigeria at the moment. I've just had about 5 interviews so far. I started just about 2 weeks back. So these are some of the things I've found out already with my research. The first, on the quantitative side, is that the measurement of modularity shows across these two movements that there are strong community structures and strong homophily with regards to the nodes or the users on these Twitter platforms. And that most of the activities clustered around certain influential nodes, implying the existence of very influential persons within that social media space that drive the success of mobilization. Also, some other important things emerge. The first is that video uploads were significant in both instances. They were the triggering factors for each of these protest movements that sparked out outrage and indignation. Then there were the preconditions for political opportunity across these two, basically economic depression that stifled a lot of the growth within these economies. In Zimbabwe, Raftopoulos details that hyperinflation got to really disastrous levels, over 230 million %. I think Ivan even narrates how he was on the queue to buy bread, and on getting for a very costly price even, and on getting to the end of the queue where it was his turn to purchase that loaf of bread, he found that the price had gone up. So this sort of exemplified the kind of hyperinflation that Zimbabwe was riddled with at the time. And when you add this on the effect of dissatisfaction with the political leadership and the autocracy of Robert Mugabe and the ZANU-PF party at that time, one can understand the necessary preconditions that were set for the emergence of dissent. And even for the Zimbabwean case, it's important to note that prior to the emergence of ThisFlag, there were some other protest events that happened immediately that also helped to create that stimulus effect. So there was the Occupy Unity Square protest led by Jamara that also created the required grounds for the success of such dissent to really happen. And ThisFlag as well came up alongside, co-occurring with hashtag Tajamuka, that sort of, and when talking with some of the activists so far, I realized that both movements sort of reinforced themselves. So these were some of the preconditions that set the springboard for the emergence of these protest movements. And then more importantly, the emergence of nationalist and popular resistance symbols. In the case of Zimbabwe, this is very interesting because prior to the protests, ZANU-PF had sort of set a hegemonic Zimbabwean historiography, also known as patriotic history, reframing the experience of Zimbabwe, the nationalist struggles of Zimbabwe, in terms that put ZANU-PF on the upper rung, that put and also sort of stifled dissent and create what many will argue as the rhetoric of sellouts and heroes. You know, so Mawarire latches onto this symbolism to galvanize and mobilize people by drawing attention to the flag, the colors of the flag, which are reminiscent of national identity. And even though that identity is one that was framed by ZANU-PF's hegemonic hold on Zimbabwe. And then you also see that national identity reframing occurring within also the Nigerian case with the emergence of the concept of the Sorosoke generation. Sorosoke in Yoruba means to speak out. So the youth galvanized under that identity. And then lastly, the use of decentralization in both cases, that even in ThisFlag's case that was led by Mawarire, he details that a lot of the protest was organized through decentralized means, enabling voices on the ground to take up action and organize protests within their vicinities. I think that's all. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to feedback.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nicholas. That's some excellent timekeeping there. Okay, so who is up next on our discussant, I believe? You want to respond to anything?
All right, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Nicholas. I think this is very interesting research. It points out quite a number of issues that I think are important that need to be addressed, especially talking about the transition from the tweet to the street. And I really like that. I just have maybe 4 points that I just want to highlight, seeking more clarification, also things that you might want to think about. So the question for me is, when we're talking about it from tweet to the street, connective to collective, it appears as a chicken and egg thing. What begins first, right? When you look at Mawarire's case, when you look at EndSars, at what point does one affect the other, cause the other? And that links quite well with identity formation. At what point is this identity formed, right? Such that people will identify with this flag, and what do they get from that? What sort of identity do they get? So what begins first? I think the cause and effect is something that I think might be helpful in clarifying, especially if you're looking at the identity formation. The points that you made towards the end, particularly in the case of Zimbabwe, where you're talking about the work that had been done by Jamuka, for instance, Itai Zamara, Patson Zamara, and a few others, to some extent provided the grounding that people needed, such that the Mawarires and this flag had some base to stay on, right? So what began, in this case, someone might argue that the street began first, and then this was kind of like an end product of it. So maybe just clarifying that aspect. The second thing is the question about the leadership and what they are leading. Mawarire, right until the end, he denied that he was the leader of this flag. Maybe it was for political reasons, because once you're identified as the leader, once you're arrested, that's the end of it. So he denied that there was any organization at all, making it feel like this is a mass movement of people that just arose on their own. And I argue that it never really happens like that. People are always organized. There's always a leader in some sense. So even when we talk about all these hashtags, the people who create the hashtag are they, to some extent, assume the leadership of those. They may just be behind, but they are to some extent leading. So if you look at this, you might end up perhaps having, like in the case of this flag, a lone charismatic leader who drives the whole hashtag movement. And once that leader changes or decides they are not interested in this anymore, that is to some extent the end of it. And that was the fate that this flag went through. And these people are leading what a colleague of mine and myself call loosely connected or loosely networked individuals. And I think that speaks to what you're talking about identity formation. So these are people who do not know each other. These are people who have just been brought together because they've probably seen the hashtag trending on X, and I feel, oh, this looks interesting, all right? And you just click on it and that's it. But there's no investment, and I think you pointed that clearly. And how do you harness these loosely connected individuals who are in the comfort of their homes or wherever they are, to actually then become a collective movement that is able to go into the streets. And that's where I think we need to think beyond what is happening online to thinking about the organization that goes on in the physical space that harnesses what is happening online to drive action on the ground. And so the identity that then sticks, and that's my third point about the transient nature of these online identities. In Zimbabwe, I don't know about Nigeria, but in Zimbabwe, the government has become quite good in diverting people's attention. So they may start a scandal of some sort, or a sex tape gets leaked, and then people move, shift their attention from ThisFlag to suddenly this thing that is more exciting. And so what you have then is these loosely connected individuals who do not have a shared identity and a shared cause. They quickly shift to something else. And then it might be now end revenge porn. They've moved on. So how do these identities stay on, and to what effect? I think is something that might be interesting to explore. And then finally, my last point is this deliberate mobilization, or this is accidental mobilization that happens, right? So Ivan Moria was really shocked and surprised by the success ThisFlag had, right? And so they had to quickly start organizing because things have moved ahead of them, right? What do we do with all these people who are looking at us for leadership, right? And then you start trying to organize to harness all these things that people who are already kind of like rallying behind you. So perhaps exploring then what happens in these cases where there is accidental success and there is no organizational framework to harness what has happened online and then translate it into the streets. And I'm not really vexed with the EndSars, but it might be interesting to explore that, because I think he had significant success than the Zimbabwean case had. And how did they achieve that? So those are the 4 points that I had, and I'll stop here.
I think that's really useful, actually. It's going somewhat along the ways that what I was thinking as well. Wonderful. Thank you very much, discussant, for that. How about the peer commentator? Selam, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicholas. That was really interesting, actually, and I will be stealing some of your notes, and I'll make sure to give credit as well. Thank you. And I agree with most of what Dr. Hodzi said, and I don't want to repeat on those. So for me, I think just a couple of things that stood out for me, and kind of a question or maybe like a suggestion for more exploration is, and luckily I'm slightly more familiar on the EndSars rather than the ThisFlag movement. So for me, because I look at these movements mostly from Pan-African and African feminist perspectives, I know the EndSars movement was supported a lot by the feminist coalition, I think, the Nigerian feminist coalition, both on the online aspect and also the offline organizing. And I wonder how you see that, or how you articulate the involvement of the FEMCO for the success of EndSars, or maybe you might argue that it was not a central contribution, but I think most studies show that they had, as a collective, they had like a significant contribution to this. And to me, this is important because usually when we talk about whether it's colonial movements, other political movements, and so forth, in Africa in general, usually the stories tend to be really incomplete because they write out the involvement of the women for the most part, where they have like a significant, if not more, contribution to the success of any political movement, I would even say. So so I wonder how you're kind of writing within your context, or even like this idea of collective identity when you're exploring it. To what extent do you see the contribution of these organizations that exist online or offline, or rather like virtually or offline and how they contribute to the collective identity formation, or like in the end, like to be identified as that. And my other comment is, I think you mentioned around the beginning how the online activism tends to be seen as no risk kind of activism, like with no consequences. I'm not sure if there might be more details in your full chapter, but I argue that that usually tends to be a misconception of how we understand risk itself, especially for women online activists. I think there still is a lot of risk and a lot of vulnerability for any political activist. Really, that comes with the visibility, comes vulnerability, and Medrado and Rega, I think, discussed this in length in one of their works, and how visibility in the online space leads to heavy vulnerability and a lot of censorship and a lot of amendment of laws, even to kind of crack down on these activists or organizations or anyone. So I would argue that it's not a non-risk entirely, unless you're anonymous, and even that there is a lot of risk that would come associated with it. And this is without accounting to the cultural capital that requires, the financial resource it requires to stay online, to engage, in the emotional resource that it takes. So I think we associate effort with like a physical presence of somewhere, the traditional organizing of, belonging to an association, contributing financially and so forth. But this online engagement has these factors as well. So I wonder how you look into that as well. So these are the main points I have really, and thank you. That was great.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Selam. That's some really good points that you made there. Nicholas, do you want to have a couple of minutes to reply? And then hopefully we still have a good amount of time for our Q&A from our attendees, which I would also like to invite to leave comments in the chat or questions in the chat if you don't feel like you want to say them out loud or whatever. That's an option too. But please, Nicholas, do you have any immediate replies to that, or?
Yes, thank you very much. These are very useful comments that I've also been thinking around. Interestingly, the first comment that Obert makes is one that has come up also in my interviews. The fact that the streets may have actually started the protest. In the EndSars protest, some of those I've interviewed already say that that the protest actually started on the streets in Ughelli Delta State and started to translate online. So I'm also keen on looking at the dynamics of that tension between offline, online, and what's happening, and to see exactly the nuances that one can observe across these two protests. So I'm keen on looking at that and understanding it even further. On the question of leadership, I think this is quite a slippery slope, given that, and it's also interesting given that I'm looking at two somewhat protests that are somewhat different in structure. In EndSars, they argue that it was leaderless. I argue that EndSars was majorly composed of pockets of diffuse leadership. Touching just a bit on what Selam said, the FEMCO, or the Feminist Coalition, was one group that sort of led some part of the protest in terms of its voices. And there were also a couple of other groups that sort of led or were faces to the protest. However, there was no central leadership. And even when the government called for a sit down, they were unable to pinpoint anybody to come and lead the protest or to come out as figureheads of the protest. And even at sometimes the protest itself transformed into an animal that was literally eating up anyone who wanted to stand up as a leader to the protest and pushing them aside. So in that stead, it's interesting to look at the success of these two protests. One of the key things I'm asking activists is also around how that factored as a strength or an Achilles heel for the success of the protest. For EndSars, one found that at some point there was some need for bureaucratization. The government needed some to talk at the table one-to-one with some of those who were sort of leading the protest. And because there was no key voice, it was difficult for that to happen. And the effect of that was the reprisal by the government by the mass shooting at the Lekki toll gate to totally quell the protest with force. For ThisFlag, Mawarire argues that yes, he was the central face of the protest, but he tried to sort of get like some foot soldiers to empower people to have agency to like lead the protests in their various sites. So he's alluding to the fact that he utilized somewhat of a decentralized model to enable the protest to grow. But I think the fears that people had with EndSars is what materialized with ThisFlag, because the government just had to throw salvos at him to get him to literally nip the protests in the bud. So I think it's one dynamic that I'm also very interested in to see what exactly comes out of it, how decentralization factors as a strength or a weakness for the sustenance of mobilization. So it's something that I'm also keen on looking at. For the role of women, I think I touched on that. Yes, I'm also talking to some members of the Feminist Coalition to hear their perspective. There are also some very dynamic parts of the story where they were accused of financial misappropriation and all of that. So I'm keen also to hear from them. They were very key factors in the success of the protest because they offered the financial mobilization to move the protest forward. They raised, I think, over $200 and something thousand through Bitcoin and donations from around the world that they used to push the protest forward and to finance some of the offline protest venues. On the misconception of risk, I do agree. I put up that to highlight some of the criticisms that have come against the relevance of contention. And many argue that these new forms of contention literally do nothing. So they are not really worth it. They're just a storm in a teacup, you know. But I feel that, like you said, they misconceptualize risk, because when you look at even the way the government reacts to these protests, in the EndSars case, there are people that have been jailed, are still in jail at the moment because of their participation online in these protests. So it tells you the story of how they're still exposed to risk and how even tweeting online can be some form of commitment and sacrifice.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, this is good response. I really wanted to reserve the time to hear from our audience. Does anyone have any questions out there? Let's give them a minute. Otherwise, I have a question.
Thanks, Nicholas, for an excellent presentation. I think it is quite relevant to what I'm working on the role of the social movements in the rule of law and protection of human rights in the global South. I think it's one of the challenges which we face when we conduct the research is how to make this decision on number of tweets, which profiles we are supposed to choose to collect these tweets from, and then how to develop that themes from these number of tweets. So I'm really interested in, you did mention around 180K tweets from different profiles, but I'm interested in what were the factors that determine this particular number of tweets, why not higher than what you chose and why not lower than that, and what were the specific profiles which you went for. Thank you.
Very interesting question. Actually, I'm scaling down even that number that I have currently to drill down for quality rather than quantity. Also, the ergams, because of the heavy nature of running ergams or these diffusion models, my system cannot really run a lot of these. So I have to run some of these on a supercomputer. So I'm scaling down. That has brought a lot of skepticism as to exactly what part of the entire population I should scale down to. So I'm basically looking at quality, or the quality of the tweets that particularly were not just using the hashtag, but we're saying something particular about the movement. In choice of it, I experienced a lot of difficulties in access to the tweets initially, because the Twitter platform at the moment is not allowing researchers access. And so I had to navigate that challenge through utilizing public platforms like Kaggle and GitHub, where a lot of researchers are co-sharing data that they're analyzing accordingly. So these tweets were gathered from these two public platforms that I'm then drilling down for quality, in terms of quality. So, yeah.
Great. Yeah, that was also actually a question I had. Unless there's other questions, you can raise your hand. It's finally, I get to say something. The first thing I noticed, Nicholas, was that your research question seems to assume something. It says, how does, do you know it by heart, your research question? Maybe you can say it again.
So how does hashtag activism influence the formation and mobilization of collective political identities in the different socio-political contexts of EndSars and ThisFlag?
Great, that's much better than I could have recalled. Does it though? That's something we can ask you, kind of assuming that it's gonna do, that it does. Basically, you know, I like the fact that you included a critical note in your literature about, you know, how, you know, there's a lot of collectivism out there. It's very easy to go online and just put your opinion there, you know, and then, you know, there's a lot of moralizing. Scholars have shown that. Also a lot of gesturing, like, oh, I don't agree with this, or yeah, fight SARS, maybe, I don't know. So it can become like almost a lifestyle to kind of be active, you know, and a lot of scholars have pointed out that actually online activism might be taking away from actual activism just because it's so easy to put your opinion out there. But you did include this critical note, which made me very happy. But what I did not find, perhaps, was, you know, any literature that you mentioned about that collectivism, how likely it is that it's actually there. How about the quality of discussion that we find online? That tends to be very much, you know, or in the feed, tends to be very much verging to extremism. It can be very symbolic, simplistic. You know, people want to get attention to themselves, to monetize that attention. And, you know, you end up with just a lot of loud voices who might not actually be that engaged in what they are saying. It's more about, let's have a party here, and there's a lot of moral grandstanding. So scholars have also shown that sometimes these movements are very unclear about the actual issue. So you've got a lot of very popular hashtags like Black Lives Matter, but then if you ask people, well, what do they want? Then people can't quite say that. It's because there's no clear definitions being set off out of, this is what we want to accomplish, this is why that's important. And if you don't do that, if you don't define something like that, then it can be very hard to find that solutions, or as you said it, political change, which is what obviously we would want to see come out of that. But based on scholarship out there, and mine as well, I kind of doubt that this is what happens. You know, you have to be careful with assuming that this is going to be, you know, a kind of, you run the risk of being a bit too celebratory with, yes, this is great, people can go online and civic movement is taking place and mobilization. Maybe they're just having fun. Maybe they're just moralizing. Maybe they're just, as Obert said, maybe people are in their living rooms doing other things and leaving a review for the place they had dinner at the same time, and they go like, yeah, but there might not be so much engagement. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very valid concern. Firstly, on the issue of my question, I think that's a good one. I'm going to look at it more. So I've been reframing that question over and over again. So maybe it will go through some new iterations itself. In terms of online activism taking away from traditional activism, I want to think of it more in terms of that these two sort of go hand in glove, that they're working together. I think sometimes scholars maybe want to delineate their influence, to speak of online activism as itself and offline activism as a separate thing altogether. And that's the reason why I'm doing mixed methods, to look at what's happening online and also talk to people, activists themselves, to understand also some of the offline strategies that were happening, interfacing with what was going on online. So I think that most of these protest movements were hybrid movements that were latching onto online, what was happening online, to increase their surface area for mobilization, and also to share information. And at the same time, we're carrying out a lot of these protest events offline. And I feel that, well, one could argue that with the way social media has sort of evolved to our present day, a lot of what the challenges you point out are pertinent. Like Twitter now is being monetized, so you see a lot of people are now interested in engagement just for the fun of it. At the period that I'm looking at, Musk was not in the reins of power at Twitter, and a lot of these dynamics were not there. So I think maybe there was some difference in how people were mobilizing around some of these issues that is sort of changing as the Twitter algorithm is also changing as well. I feel that these issues were also they're issues that really struck at the heart of people. So I would take an exception to maybe thinking they were just tweeting for fun, because even if they were some may have been tweeting from their living rooms, a lot of these issues, like the issue of police brutality, most of those I've interviewed so far speak with livid passion about their experiences, both with the police themselves as well as with the protest itself. And even in Zimbabwe, the challenge with inflation and a lot of the economic challenges that Zimbabweans were struggling with at the time, and is it still even present currently with the March 31st protests. So I struggle with thinking of it in terms of maybe this what's it called, the extreme angle of collectivism. I know that some persons may be unwilling to go out into the streets and may rather tweet for to disseminate the information even more widely, but there are still people that are willing to tweet and go to the streets, to effect action, and those are some of the people I've been talking to.
Oh, that's very interesting indeed. Thank you, Nicholas. It was, a wonderful presentation. I think we all enjoyed it. And thank you very much as well to Dr. Hodzi and Selam for their very, very useful comments. I should say Selam, Tadesse, isn't it? And I have to thank everyone as well who attended today's session. But I think this project has really got legs, and it's going to make a solid contribution to the wider literature on the role of social media in shaping collective political identities. Very interesting. So, as a last note, the Global South Network warmly welcomes PhD students from any discipline at all and any part of the world to share their projects here and receive interdisciplinary feedback like we had today. So anyone interested who's listening, who receives this, should get in touch with Dr. Nauman, Riyadh, to see if they can present their work, on the Global South Network. The email address will be provided in the chat box. Now, same time next week, let's meet our guest speaker, Aditya Verman Mehta, who is a PhD candidate at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Leeds. And they will present their project titled The Role of Global Health Diplomacy in Achieving Peace Building in Post-Conflict Northern Uganda. So that's something to look forward to, and that is next Wednesday, 16 April 2025, from 3 to 4 p.m. UK time. So thank you everyone very much again, and take care, look after yourselves, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.